this story, and it's a very kind of self-centered thing to do. I've been slow reading Marx for the last 6 years, and I'm finishing a book on animals and Marx and capitalism. And so lots of this is reflecting on, I think, what he offers, but more asking the question, and one of the initial prompts for the project was to ask, if Marx actually cared about animals, what would capitalism look like? And particularly, what would his value theory have looked like if he'd actually noticed animals? That's a lot of the project. I'm not a political economist, I'm a political theorist. And actually, the more interesting problem for me is, to what extent was capital a story about domination? To what extent was capitalism a story about a political relationship that was created through the economic system? And what does this mean for animals? And this will come out hopefully in the paper. There's been an emerging interest in animals as labourers and evolving attempts to understand the relationship between animals and capitalist exchange. And people like Mann have been very influential in shaping work that's happening globally around this. This work has attempted to make up for the failure of traditional labour theory to make sense of the role of non-humans in productive processes and to describe distinctly what it means for animals to labour. For some theorists, solidarity between humans and animals as labourers has been suggested as one outcome of this analysis. Some scholars, such as Jason Hrebraul, have gone so far as to suggest that animals and human workers share a structural position under capitalism, and Hrebraul says animals are part of the working class, end quote. Relational accounts such as that advanced by Donna Haraway, I think, affect a similar kind of tendency, where there's maybe a shared set of resonances or entanglements that these authors have tried to highlight. And certainly from the standpoint of animal advocacy, I think there's strong reasons to suggest that humans and animals share some sort of political program or own solidarity, as this allows for alliance building and visions on what justice, including economic justice, might look like. However, I worry that such visions, in rushing to proclaim solidarity, fail to pay attention to the specifics of the relation of animals to humans under capitalism, and thus risk false proclamations of solidarity when in fact there are deep divisions or antagonisms. Antagonism was of central importance to Marx's analysis of capitalism. The story is familiar, but let's rehearse it quickly. One of the aims of Marx's analysis was to demonstrate the way that one's relationship to labour power fundamentally determined its value, its use value. These differences in use value produce antagonism between the proletarian and the money owner or the capitalist, since these two parties had very different interests. The formation of class as a structural relation derives from this clash of interests, and as Marx has argued, the tendency of capitalist social relations was to intensify the fault lines of this antagonism and concentrate this class relationship as the primary social relation. And this distinction you can see here, that the basic story of the worker is interested in their own labour because this is the means of survival. The capitalist, on the other hand, is interested in the surplus that can be derived from this labour. And these are two fundamentally irreconcilable interests. Unfortunately, it's not self-evident that animals share the same class relationship as human workers. This is because there are arguably multiple antagonisms that shape these relations. I don't have time to cover all of these antagonisms, but let me start with a very obvious sight. I would argue that our primary and least most prominent entangled relationship with non-human animals is in their use as food. The scale of this is really difficult to quantify, but of course we can start to try and quantify this. We currently slaughter, I would say, about 75 to 80 billion land animals per year. We don't have an accurate number in relation to fish, but it's something like 3 trillion, up to 3 trillion wild caught fish, and maybe 200 to 300 billion animals, fish in aquaculture, which I'll talk about in a second. Most of these animals that are used for human food are raised intensively. So although there's lots of examples of, say, subsistence utilizations of animals or hunting, the vast proportion, I think the UN Food and Agriculture Organization says something like 90% or something like that of animals are intensively reared. We have a growing global aquaculture industry. which is now accounting for a significant proportion of consumption of fish. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization announced in 2014 that half of fish consumed by humans now comes from factory farms or from aquaculture. And this, I just note, is a dramatic shift in human relationship with animals. The fact that we, over the period of 4 decades, have domesticated fish at this scale is just monstrous to consider. Animals who become food serve a distinct function within the cycles and production and reproduction of capitalism. These animals who engage in production are transformed into consumption products, which will become a means of subsistence for humans who in turn provide labour and energies within the circuits of capitalism. As such, animals, this is my really bad diagram, as such animals are positioned as the means of consumption which allows for the reproduction of human labour, and in a broad sense allows for social reproduction itself. Animals allow for the production of human productive and reproductive labour in this story, and one way to think about it is animals become the means of consumption, humans consume them, they labour, they produce stuff, and in a weird way they also produce the means of consumption for animals in intensive animal agriculture, and the circle goes round. This, of course, means there's a primary antagonism built into the relation between humans and animals under capitalism. In simple terms, solidarity between humans and animals is not possible since humans are positioned as a consequence of the conditions of production to eat animals. That's the kind of fundamental antagonism that's there. But as the title of my paper suggests, I want to look at another site of antagonism, namely time. I picked time because I see it as both a challenge for thinking about solidarity, but also a space ripe for alliance building. And it allows also for a vision of post-capitalist societies, which I'll talk about in a second. Time is, of course, another highly central element within Marx's analysis of capitalism. Indeed, it sits at the centre of the antagonism he describes between those who sell their labour power and those who buy it. Perhaps this antagonism is expressed most strongly in Chapter 10 of Capital, on the working day. Here Marx effectively situates the body of the human worker, the worker's physicality, sustenance, capacities, biological life, as a biopolitical battleground for the extraction of surplus. It is also in this chapter that Marx reveals the texture of one of the trajectories of his analysis of capitalism as a social, economic and political relation, namely labour time as precisely the source of conflict, as the nodal point for conflict. In a remarkable section of the text, which I think is basically my favourite paragraph in Capital, Marx lays bare the contestation that shapes working time. He asks, quote, "What is a working day? What is the length of time during which capital may consume the labour power whose daily value it buys? How far may the working day be extended beyond the working time necessary for the reproduction of labour power itself?" We have capital's response to these questions, and it is this. The working day contains the full 24 hours, with the deduction of a few hours of rest without which labour power absolutely is incapable of renewing its services. Hence it is self-evident that the worker is nothing other than labour power for the duration of his whole life, and that therefore all his disposable time is by nature and by right labour time, to be devoted for the self-valorization of capital. Time for education, for intellectual development, for fulfilling the social functions, for social intercourse, for the free play of the vital forces of the body of the mind, even rest day of Sunday may be susceptible. But in its blind and measureless drive, in its insatiable appetite for surplus labour, capital oversteps not only the moral but even the merely physical maximum bounds of the working day. Capital asks no questions about the length of life of labour power. What interests it purely and simply is the maximum labour power that can be set in motion. It attains this objective by shortening the life of labour power, and in the same way as a greedy farmer snatches more produce from the soil by robbing it of its fertility. Now, what fascinates me about this is that it's not necessarily about humans, and I'll get to this. And it also offers a vision for justice. These sections of Capital are highly productive for animal advocates. On one hand, it removes focus from the wage relation as central to capitalism, instead revealing capitalism as an organism which seeks to suck, vampire-like, as Marx describes actually in this section of the German text, or werewolf-like actually in the German text, suck energy, but particularly to suck time. Secondly, Marx's analysis of the working day offers a political narrative for change which resonates around the politics of time itself. Time here is the site of antagonism. The starting point for thinking about time in Marx's analysis is the difference between labour time to meet the costs of reproduction and that which will be taken away as surplus. Naturally, under capitalism, humans are paid a wage as their exploitative proportion in order to cover reproduction costs. However, payment of a wage does not need to be central to this problem of time, since we can take the view that capitalism will always seek to minimise the reproduction costs of labour and maximise surplus extracted, regardless of whether a wage is paid or reproduction costs are met directly through inputs to production, such as feeding grain to an animal working in a site of production. The reason I suggest this approach is that it allows us to see the unique antagonism that occurs between human and animal workers in the context of animal agriculture. The imperative always remains the same: reduce labour time. However, the implications for humans and animals are different. For human workers, the tendencies are predictable. Firstly, capitalism will seek an expansion in so-called absolute surplus value by expanding the working day. Certainly, we see this happening globally in all forms of precarious, low-wage and forced labour work that appears endemic as it happens to animal agriculture, where workers are not only subject to demanding or dangerous work, but also forced to work beyond the social norms of the working day. For example, forced labourers engaged in wild fish capture or seafood processing. Secondly, capitalism will seek to intensify time to make it more productive. This is, of course, the tendency with increased line speeds globally in animal agriculture, which effectively intensify the amount of productivity that happens over the same period of time. Connected to this general tendency in animal agriculture, we find human workers replaced by machines. So this is the other way that you intensify the productivity of human labour efficiencies. Here, human labour efficiencies are won through the replacement of humans with machines. In some cases, such as robotic dairy farms, human labour is completely supplanted. For animals, however, we have a very different set of relationships and a different set of antagonisms. Firstly, in all animal agriculture, animals are compelled to work. That is, their labour time is forced labour time. In a basic agricultural system such as the shepherd-flock relationship, we can see that human labour time is usually devoted, or often devoted, to dominating animals to convince them to labour. So rounding them up, branding them, sending them to slaughter. This is part of the way that human labour time is devoted. Thus, there's initial antagonism built into animal agriculture in the structural position of human and animal workers. Capitalism impels humans to labour, to force animals to in turn labour on themselves, to become a means of consumption for human workers to in turn reproduce their own labour. Secondly, as capital arrives into animal agriculture, humans increasingly vacate the scene by being replaced by machines and other fixed capital. This antagonism means that instead of humans being the ones doing the dominating, machines and fixed capital do the dominating. Machines and fixed capital, in a sense, wage a war against animals within factory farms, and that's basically what the factory farm is. Here, a machine is replaced by direct human interactions, and it compels animals to labour. But thirdly, and importantly, animal labour cannot be replaced. This is because we eat animals. They are the product. The conditions of production of animals dictate an accelerated production of cheap consumption commodities, and as an outcome of these processes, more and more animals are produced, therefore their labour cannot be directly replaced. I note further that the mass consumption of animals as mass consumption items links back to the problem of human labour efficiencies. This is because cheap consumption commodities effectively hold down human wages and thus increase the relative surplus value that is extracted from human workers. Thus, we face the curiosity in animal agriculture that as human labour efficiencies increase, that is, as relative human labour time declines, the mass of animal labour has to increase, since these animals are both the labour and the commodity and will become the finished products. Finally, capitalism's response to this reality has been to utilise similar processes to affect labour efficiencies in relation to animal labour, while still meeting the goals of mass production of consumption products. It has done this through two familiar routes, although we haven't necessarily thought about these in labour terms. Firstly, animal lives have been shortened to reduce the production cycle for the realisation of the consumption commodity. Thus, over the past 50 years, broiler chickens have been genetically selected to effectively halve growing time, speeding production and increasing profitability. Halving growing time is equivalent to halving animal labour time. Because capital has subsumed the whole life of animals within production processes, then therefore their whole life is labour, then halving labour time effectively is achieved by halving the lives of these animals. Secondly, although capital cannot do anything to reduce the mass of animal labour deployed, it can improve its relative efficiency through increasing its yield. Thus, it's not just that chickens are grown quicker, it is also that they're selectively bred to grow bigger. The point of all this is to show that at the level of time, we face some contradictory phenomena in relation to the status of human workers and those of animal workers. At least in animal agriculture, indeed I would say that, at least in this space, I would say that animals and humans have a different antagonistic relation to capital. And with this, antagonisms between humans and animals, they will cast in doubt the possibilities for solidarity. I would suggest that some of these factors imply that food animals were structurally positioned during the history of capitalism in the context of industrial animal agriculture, and as such perhaps possess a unique class position within capitalism, one that's differentiated from the proletarian. Does this mean that solidarity is impossible? Actually, I think the thing is that time is productive for both thinking about this antagonism I've described, but also, weirdly, solidarity. Here we can consider carefully the normative promise of time as a category of justice. The advantage of foregrounding time as a calculation is that it measures the imposition of productive systems upon the subjective being of the living, labouring subject. Time matters because life is limited, and we all know this. That's why time matters. As organic subjects, our time as living subjects has a definite end, and this means that the question of how much time we labour versus how much time we spend doing other things is important for us, for our flourishing. Traditional justice theories focus on the distribution of resources or the justness of political institutions. But they don't, I think, focus on time as a subject of justice, or not overtly. From a multi-species vantage, the realisation of time is a goal shared between humans and animals, at least insofar as animals are themselves not indifferent to how they spend their time. At least it's fairly clear to me, it may not be clear to many, that animals would prefer not to spend their time in a small cage growing to become consumption products for us. Indeed, if we could imagine shared campaigns to reduce the intensity of animal agriculture, which would benefit both humans, human workers, and animal workers within these spaces. One example is slowing down line speeds. This directly benefits both human labourers and animal labourers. The second is a demand for animals to live a full life. Again, against the tendency to halve the lives of animals, why shouldn't we be asking for animals to live a full life if we're going to eat them, right? But I raise here a different prospect for solidarity because increasingly the broader vectors of struggle against capitalism appear to resonate with a demand that centres around time. There are now numerous competing visions for post-capitalist solutions emerging from left and green politics, some of which, for example, have attempted to imagine no growth or negative growth economies, which are essentially questions centred around time. At the same time, there's been a discussion of the politics of work and its place within progressive politics, and a growing interest in automation and the promise this holds for a post-work society where we don't have to spend our time working away. However, in none of these visions we find a post-anthropocentric proposal. And I think there's something interesting about thinking, what does this mean beyond the human species? What does a post-anthropocentric project aimed at reducing necessary labour time and increasing free time look like? What attracts me to this latter project is that it opens a set of questions that equally apply between humans and non-humans. Namely, how much labour time is required within our social and economic organisations to sustain life and allow it to flourish? How much more labour is required to meet our future needs as a society? And do we actually need to labour? The latter question remains sharply unanswered within our contemporary world of continuing mass accumulation, Does work or labour time contribute or degrade the flourishing of beings, human or non-human? And what would it mean to be rid of work, either human or non-human, from the societies we are imagining? Thank you.